Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Anna Inario, and I'm part of the marketing team that helps put on the PARC Forums. We're very pleased tonight to have Niriyal with us. He takes psychology, technology, business, and encompasses user design all together with a little bit of a neuroscience as well. He writes for TechCrunch, Forbes, Psychology Today, and as you know, he has written Hooked. We'll have the books available outside for you. He's worked in the video gaming industry as well as the advertising so that he can understand the techniques for motivating and manipulating some of the users. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Niriyal.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thanks. So welcome, everyone. So happy to be here tonight. It's a real pleasure. You know, if there's one thing we know about the technology that we use every day, is that it can profoundly change our day-to-day behaviors. And so I've spent the past 2.5 years looking at what is it about these companies that can so profoundly change our behaviors and our day-to-day habits. And I've found some patterns that I see reoccurring time and time again. And one of these patterns is that these companies that can change our daily habits tend to start out as toys, as nice-to-haves, as these products that somehow within the span of 5 to 10 years' time are touching hundreds of millions of users' lives and making hundreds of millions, if not billions, of dollars. Now, what companies come to mind when I give that description? Shout out some of these companies that come to mind. A little more recently, Facebook. Yeah, the $155 billion behemoth. The first time you saw it, did you really think it'd be Facebook like it is today? What else? Instagram. Great example, right? Founded right over here at Stanford. 18 months, 12 people, $1 billion acquisition by Facebook, and now it turns out that was actually cheap because the latest and greatest acquisition is, of course, WhatsApp. $19 billion acquisition for this little messaging client. Well, why is that $19 billion price so justified? I mean, okay, there could be other factors, but one of the big reasons, if you need proof about how habits matter in technology, it's that 74% of the people who have installed that app use it every single day. Talk about the power of habits. So I've spent the past several years looking at these patterns that we find endemic to these habit-forming technologies that we see repeated time and time again. As mentioned, I codified what I learned inside this book called Hooked, How to Build Habit-Forming Products, and I've written on my blog here at nearandfar.com. And the first question that I started when I went on this exploration, the first question I wanted answered was, are these products vitamins or painkillers? Because if you've ever raised money on Sand Hill Road or you've had investors in your company before, you may have heard this question. Because investors, they like to invest in painkillers. These are products that address the user's needs, right? You may have been asked this question, even if not from investors, probably from internal stakeholders at the companies you work at. You have some great idea, and maybe the boss says in one word or one turn of phrase or another, is this product really needed? Is it really a painkiller? That's the kind of stuff that generally people like to back. Investors like to invest in, the painkillers. They have quantifiable markets that are eminently addressable. What they don't like to invest in are the vitamin products, these nice-to-haves. We don't really know if Fred Flintstone is doing his job every morning when we take our multivitamins, but it feels good knowing that we're doing something about our health. It's not about efficacy. It's about emotion. And investors will ding you if they deem your product to just be a vitamin. It's not really necessary to people's day-to-day lives. So here's my question to you. These products that I just solicited from you just a minute ago that have, within a few short years' time, changed our day-to-day lives, so profoundly affected our habits, what are they? The Pinterest and Instagrams and Facebook and Twitter. Are they vitamins or are they painkillers? How many of you think they're vitamins? How many of you think they're painkillers? Okay, pretty 50-50 even split there. Well, before you make up your mind, let me posit this thought. That a habit is when not doing a particular behavior causes a bit of pain. Habit is when not doing a particular behavior causes a bit of pain. Because what we find is endemic to habit-forming technologies is that they start out as pleasure-seeking behaviors. They start out as vitamins. And through continued use, they become painkillers. They become must-haves. They become facets in our day-to-day lives which we have difficulty operating without. Now, when I say pain, let me be very specific about what I mean by pain and painkillers and pain points. I'm not talking about this kind of pain, right? It's not physical pain. But to show you exactly what I mean, I'd like you to indulge me in a little mind experiment. What I'd like you to do for a moment is to please close your eyes. And I want you to imagine, with your mind's eye, that you have just received an important message. In whatever medium it is that you use when someone important contacts you. Okay? Think about that message. Is it an email? Is it a text? Is it a message me message? Whatever it might be, that when someone important needs to contact you, think about that message right now, blinking at you, waiting for you. And I want you to think about how your body feels at this very moment. And give whatever it is you're feeling a name right now. Put a name to what you're experiencing. Now open your eyes and just shout out how you felt. Tell me how you felt just now. Urgency. Anxious. Number one response I hear. It's always the number 1, 2, or 3 response. Anxiety. Every time I do this exercise. What else? Power. Okay. A bit of power. Yeah, what else?
Happiness that I got the message.
Happy you got the message. Great. Excitement. You have to do something. A bit of urgency. Connected. Great. So all of these emotions, what you just felt, was what I call the itch. It's a psychological stimulus. It's a physical response in response to a psychological stimulus. Something just changed in many of your bodies. Many of you felt a physical reaction to this psychological stimulus. There was no message. I made it up. It doesn't exist. Many of you have this urge right now to check your email, I bet. Right? That's the itch. And it's this itch that we seek to scratch. That's the painkiller. And of course, how we react to that discomfort, how we find solutions to our discomfort, defines our technology habits. Now, what I want to be clear about, first and foremost, is that this is not about addiction. Addiction has a very specific definition. Addictions are persistent compulsions or dependencies on a behavior or substance, and addictions are always bad. Okay? Addictions always hurt the user. But what I'm talking about is something that's a little different. It's not something that's always bad, as in the case of addictions. What I'm referring to is something that's potentially good or bad. Of course, I'm referring to habits. We have good habits and we have bad habits. Very simply stated, habits are these behaviors that are done with little or no conscious thought. It's about 50% of what we do day in and day out is done purely out of habit. And I believe that we are on the precipice of an age where we can use habits for good. And I'm not alone. There's an explosion of companies today, many of them here in Silicon Valley, using the power of designing for habit to help people live happier, healthier, more connected, richer lives by using the power of habit, by designing their products to be habit-forming. And that's what I want to help you do today. So what do we need to build a habit? Turns out that we only need 2 things. It's pretty simple. We need 2 things to form a habit. This study out of Oxford last year found that first thing that's required to form a habit is a frequent behavior. Frequency is a key element of when it comes to the likelihood of forming a habit. In this study, which was around getting people to form a habit around flossing their teeth, they found the people who flossed most often were the ones who sustained that behavior 6, 12, 18 months into the study. So frequency is a big deal. Now, if the product that you're designing is something that is used infrequently, you may have a problem. Okay? This should be a red flag for you. If you think about how frequently these products that form habits are in our day-to-day lives, how often is a product like Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, how often are these products used? Intraday behaviors. Multiple times a day, we're checking these devices using these apps. So many of you have heard this urban legend about that it takes 29 days to form a habit, 35 days, 45 days. You've heard these urban legends? Turns out there's no scientific evidence to propose that there's a single number. It's never been proven. What we do know, however, is that, number one, more frequent is better. The more often someone does a behavior, the more likely they are to form a habit. And two, that there's a precipitous drop-off if the behavior does not occur within the span of a week's time or less. A week's time or less. That seems to be the cutoff of the ability to form these habits. Now, some things we can form habits around, even if the behavior occurs less frequently, but it's very, very difficult. It's hard to do. So how frequently your product is used is endemic to your product, is endemic to the technology you're building. That's not necessarily something I can help you with. However, what I do seek to help entrepreneurs with is the second key component of creating a habit, which is attitude change. Attitude change. The way we perceive the behavior, our perceptions and attitudes of the behavior, when that changes, we become much more likely to stick with these habits. So in that study I told you about with the flossing habit, the people who went from thinking to themselves, nah, I don't need to floss my teeth, that's what my dentist does for me, to the ones who said, you know what, I can't go to bed without flossing my teeth. It feels strange to me. Those are the ones who could sustain their habits over long-term periods of time. So figuring out how to change people's perceptions of the key behavior is a key component of habit change. So we know habits can be very good for our users, for our customers. Habits can also be very good for business. You know, I teach this class at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, so I need to cover for just a few moments about why habits are very good for our bottom line. First and foremost, it turns out that habit-forming technologies can produce higher customer lifetime value, right? CLTV. So the longer someone uses our product, the more valuable that customer, that user is to the company. Second, habit-forming products have greater pricing flexibility. When people form routines and dependencies on products, it becomes something that we have more flexibility when it comes to changing the pricing structure. Next is that habit-forming products supercharge growth. Now, everybody wants their product to go viral in Silicon Valley, right? Virality is kind of this almost de facto requirement that we have to tell people why our product is going to go viral. But I'm here to tell you that viral isn't good enough. That just having a product that has a viral coefficient, one person telling more than one person about your product, is not good enough. Because not only does your product have to be viral to get that emblematic hockey stick growth, but it has to occur quickly enough. Because what's more important than just virality is a short viral cycle time. So if one person tells more than one person about your product in the course of a year, that's great. But what are you constantly fighting? You're fighting churn. You're fighting people leaving your product. So that viral cycle time has to occur very, very quickly. And we find the products that have this emblematic growth curve are the ones that are used frequently, are these habit-forming products that are used multiple times a day and therefore shared very often. And then finally, the last point around why habits are good for business is that habit-forming products increase defensibility. That we become less likely to use a competitor's product when we're not thinking about it as an alternative. So let me give you a great example. How many of you have searched with Google in the past 24 hours? How many of you have searched with Bing in the past 24 hours? One Microsoft employee is in the room. Why is that? It's because Google is way better, right? Google is just a better search engine. The geniuses over at Google just built a much better product, right? Wrong. It turns out that study after study, when you compare Bing versus Google head-to-head, when you strip out the branding, users can't tell the two apart. They rate them as equally good. And yet we use the products we've been habituated to use because that's what we've just become used to using. Right? The interface just looks the right way. We just use the product because it's something we don't even consider the alternatives around. That's the defensibility. That's the power of designing for habit. The problem is that forming new user habits is very hard work. And it's exceptionally rare. When you think of these companies who have had these massive impacts by forming habit-forming technologies, we count them on one or two hands. Right? Very hard to do. However, if your business model requires what I call unprompted user engagement. Unprompted user engagement. So users checking their phones, using your product, checking your website, unprompted, without any kind of external triggering. And by the way, not every business model needs that. There are plenty of businesses that bring users to their product without habits. Right? You can use marketing, you can use search engine optimization. Heck, you can use physical storefronts. Many of these businesses make a lot of money, do really good work for their customers, and don't form habits. That's fine. But if you have a business model that's like these companies we mentioned earlier, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, all these companies, they depend upon unprompted user engagement. And if that's the kind of company you're working with and the product you're working on, then what I'm going to share with you today is a design pattern intended to help you form better product hypotheses. Now, what do I mean by that? Who's familiar with lean startup methodologies? Almost everybody, right? We've all heard about lean startup. What are the 3 steps of lean startup as espoused by Eric Ries and Steve Blank? It's build, measure, and learn, right? Build, measure, learn. Those are the 3 steps of the lean startup methodology. Build, measure, and learn. What's the most expensive part of build, measuring, and learning? Building, right? The building phase. The measuring and the learning is fun. That's the easy part. Once you've set up the infrastructure, measuring and learning is easy. But the building phase is where the blood, sweat, and tears all go. So I propose that if we can look deeper than what customers are just able to tell us, and look into the psychology of what users do, the things that they're not able to articulate, we'll spend more time building the right thing sooner. And that's what I want to help you do. I want to help you come up with the hypotheses to build the right thing sooner. Okay? That's the whole goal of this methodology. So here's the pattern. Here's the design pattern that we see time and time again in habit-forming products so that you can decide which features to build first. And this pattern, this experience, is called the hook. The hook, very simply, is an experience designed to connect your user's problem to your solution with enough frequency to form a habit. Connecting your user's problem to your solution with enough frequency to form a habit. And these hooks that we see time and time again in habit-forming technologies have 4 steps, 4 phases. They start with a trigger, an action, a reward, and finally, an investment. So we're going to walk through these 4 phases. Starts off with a trigger. Now, if there's one thing I want you to take away from today's talk is that habits aren't created. We can't just will new behaviors in our users. We can't just snap our fingers and have them do the things that we've designed for them to do, no matter how great our technology is. That in fact, habits are built upon. And the metaphor I like to use here is a pearl. Does anybody know how a pearl is formed? How's a pearl formed? Yeah, layer by layer. It's a tiny grain of sand or some kind of irritant, a parasite, gets inside the oyster, and to protect itself, the oyster forms layer upon layer upon layer of this substance called mother of pearl until if you were to cut a cross-section of a pearl, you would actually see it has rings, kind of like the rings of a tree. And this is a great metaphor for how we learn new behaviors. They always start with some kind of foundation. So we learn the ABCs, so we can decode words, so we can understand sentences, so that we can make sense of novels. And there's always some kind of foundation to these very complex behaviors. And those foundations we call triggers. These things cue the next action. And they come in 2 types, 2 flavors. We have external triggers and internal triggers. Now, these things that cue action, the first one you'll be very familiar with. External triggers are all over our physical environment. The designers in the room, this is what you specialize in, is designing these effective external triggers. And these are things where the information for what to do next is contained in the trigger itself. A billboard, a button that says buy now, click here, a cop on a street corner telling you where to turn your car, a friend telling you through word of mouth about an app you should really check out. These are all examples of external triggers. Now, designers, entrepreneurs, we all know a whole lot about external triggers. But what I think people don't think enough about are the internal triggers. The internal triggers are things where the information for what to do next is informed through an association in the user's mind. Okay? So these are things like certain places, situations, routines, people, and most frequently, emotions. Things that don't explicitly tell us what to do next and yet can predict our next behavior. And it turns out that the most frequent internal triggers are at the top, emotions. And not only emotions, but a specific type of emotion. I'm referring to negative emotions. When we're feeling lonesome, or tense, or indecisive, or discouraged, or bored, or lonely, or fearful, what we do in response to these negative emotions dictates our habits. These are the cues to our next action. And some of the research that shows this is the case comes out of a study that showed that people with depression check email more. Now, why would that be? Why would people with depression check email more? I gave this talk a few weeks ago. Somebody stood up in the back of the room and says, it's because email makes us depressed. Sometimes I do feel like my inbox brings me down, but that's actually not what this study found. This study found that people who suffer from clinical depression felt what psychologists call negative valence states. They felt down more frequently than the general population. And to boost their mood, they were turning to their technologies. And what do we use? What do people use? What technology do folks use when they're feeling lonely? What do we use? Facebook, right? How about when we're unsure about something? Before we actually search our mental resources, we go ahead and we Google it. And what about when we're feeling bored between 2 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon when we've got that big project that we really don't feel like working on right now? We YouTube, we go check the news, sports scores, stock prices, Pinterest. There's lots of solutions to get us out of this negative valence state of boredom. Great. So this is a bit of pop psychology. Maybe some of you, I see some of you grinning and shaking your heads that maybe you're guilty of being triggered by some of these negative emotions as well. But what do we do with this? How do we as designers, as entrepreneurs, use this knowledge? Well, it all starts from understanding our users' internal triggers. We have to understand what is the itch that we're seeking to scratch. That's the first step. Let's take a look at a company that I think really understood its users' internal triggers. Let's look at Instagram and what made Instagram such a habit-forming technology. So Instagram's external triggers, how did most people first find out about Instagram? What channels? Facebook and Twitter, right? People were posting pictures that they took on Instagram to Facebook and Twitter. And there was a call to action. There was some kind of external trigger that told them what to do next. Come check out my pictures on Instagram. So you clicked over, installed the app. Now you've got the app icon. That's an external trigger. You're also connecting it to your friends. So now every time your friends are posting, now you have more external triggers through the notifications. All examples of external triggers. Now, who here uses Instagram? Anybody use Instagram here? You do? What's your name, sir? Moaz, welcome. So can you tell us, Moaz, what the last thing you took a picture of with Instagram was, if it's suitable for work? The Golden Gate Bridge. So I'm guessing that the Golden Gate Bridge did not say, Moaz, take a picture of me with Instagram, right? So, but what happened there? What was going on? What was the internal trigger? Moaz saw something that he thought was worth keeping, and his fear of losing the moment, that solution for the fear of losing this moment in time to capture it, to hold on to it, was Instagram. Instagram wins. Now, what other company should be ringing a bell right now? What other company tried to capture the moment? Kodak. Of course, the Kodak moment. Do you all remember these commercials 20, 30 years ago? Right? These very schmaltzy commercials of the puppy dog running through the grass and the children who would someday leave the empty nest, and my personal favorite, grandma blowing out perhaps her last birthday candles. You remember these ads, right? Why did Kodak spend billions of dollars over the span of nearly 100 years on this form of advertising? What were they doing? They were teaching users that when you see this type of moment in your life, the solution to hold on to it, to capture it, to not let it go, is Kodak, the Kodak moment. Instagram did the same thing in about 18 months by having users teach other users what the Instagram moment was all about. Okay? But of course, Instagram is much more than just a way to capture photos. Instagram is also a social network. So the more users ran through these 4 steps of the hook, the more they began to associate it with other internal triggers. When you're feeling bored, lonesome, when you're feeling FOMO. What's FOMO? Fear of missing out. It's in the Merriam-Webster dictionary this year. Fear of missing out feels bad. We don't like feeling this fear that we're missing out. And the solution becomes this product, becomes this technology. Okay? Now, Instagram did all kinds of things right. This is just one thing I think they did particularly well, is understanding this moment in the user's life. Okay? So after the trigger, after we understand the user's itch through the internal trigger, we use an external trigger to get them to take the next action. The next phase of the hook is the action itself. Now, the action can be defined as the simplest behavior done in anticipation of reward. The simplest behavior done in anticipation of a reward. Now, let me show you just how simple I mean by simple. Something as easy as scrolling on Pinterest, or searching on Google, or pushing the play button on YouTube. The simplest action in anticipation of reward. And it turns out there's actually a formula for predicting the likelihood of these singular actions. It comes to us from B.J. Fogg, who's a researcher here at Stanford, or there at Stanford. And Fogg posits that for every behavior, as represented by B, we need 3 things at the same time. We need sufficient motivation, ability, and a trigger must be present for any human behavior to occur. Online, offline, doesn't matter. Okay? So let's tap into these 3 things. First is motivation. According to Edward Deci, the father of self-determination theory, motivation is very simply the energy for action, how much we want to do something. Now, psychologists have been arguing over the nature of motivation for years and years and years, but I think Fogg gives us these 6 factors that I think are simple enough to be useful in a startup context, because Fogg tells us that we're all motivated by seeking pleasure and avoiding pain, by seeking hope, avoiding fear, by seeking social acceptance and avoiding social rejection. And we find that these 6 levers are used time and time again to motivate human behavior. And there's one industry that focuses almost exclusively on manipulating these 6 levers. And of course, I'm referring to advertising. So we're going to take a little pop quiz here. I'm going to show you some ads, and I want you to tell me what motivator is being used. Not what's being sold, but what motivator is being used. The first one's a freebie. Even if the word wasn't written across the bottom of the ad, or the poster in this case, what's the president looking towards? Of course, the future. Hope for the future. Here's another one. What's being sold is fast food, hamburgers. What's the motivator? Pleasure, seeking pleasure. Now, what's the target demographic for these ads? What age and sex? Teenage boys. Not men. The target demographic is teenage boys. Why? Because for teenage boys, sex is a highly salient motivator associated with pleasure. Now, for other demographics, this doesn't work at all. When I was a teenager, this was awesome. But now that I have a 5.5-year-old little girl, and that's someone's daughter too, it's not so cool anymore. So understanding your audience's motivator is critical. You have to align the right motivator for your demographic. Absolutely critical. Here's another ad. This one is trying to persuade people to wear motorcycle helmets, and it has a man with a large scar. And he says, "I won't wear a helmet. It makes me look stupid." It says his name and his mental age is 2 years old. The motivator? Fear. Exactly. Avoiding fear. Here's one more. What's being sold is Budweiser beer. And the motivator is social acceptance. I'm having a beer with my buds. Budweiser beer. OK, so that's the motivation side. That's a very quick introduction to these 6 levers of motivation. Let's talk about ability, the second factor of B equals MAT, ability. Ability is the capacity to do a particular action. And here again, Fogg gives us these 6 levers that make a behavior more or less likely to occur by influencing ability, making a behavior easier or harder. And they are how much time something takes, how much money something costs, how much physical effort a behavior takes. Brain cycles. This is a big one when it comes to interactive technology. Because if something is difficult to understand, it is less likely that that behavior will occur. It's called cognitive load. Right? If it's difficult to understand, it's less likely for that behavior to occur. Social deviance. We become more likely to do something when we see other people like us doing it. And then finally, non-routine. And this is why habits are so important. Because non-routine dictates that we become more likely to do an action when it becomes easier because we've done it in the past. Now, what's this principle called? Because we've done something in the past, it becomes easier, so we become more likely to do it in the future. That's called practice. Practice. Okay? And this is why why habits have this repeater effect. The more we do them, the easier they become, and so we become more likely to do them in the future. Now, Fogg puts these three factors of motivation, ability, and triggers onto this graph that I think is actually very useful in a startup context, in a product development context, when you ask yourself, hey, we've designed this experience, but customers aren't doing the thing we designed them to do. What's going on? Why isn't the behavior occurring? Well, you can ask yourself, do we have enough motivation? Is the behavior easy enough to do? So if something is very easy, it's way over there on your right. If something is hard to do, it's over here on the left. And if we have sufficient motivation, sufficient ability, crosses this threshold, and if a trigger is present, the behavior will occur every time. Let me give you an example. I'll make this concrete. Think of the last time that a phone rang in your life. Phone rings, and you don't pick it up. What's the reason you didn't pick it up? Too far away. OK, so you're in the shower or some other place. You hear the phone ringing. You can't get there in time. It's too physically difficult to get there, too much work. Ability is too low. You really wanted to pick up the call, but ability is too low. The behavior doesn't occur. What's another reason?
It was an unknown number.
Unknown number. Great. So the phone was right there next to you. Very high ability. You heard it ring. The trigger was present. Low motivation. Low motivation. Behavior doesn't occur. What's one more reason that has to do with the trigger? There you go. So that has to do with ability. It's too difficult to pick up your phone and walk out of the room. That's too difficult, so too low ability. But what's a reason that has to do with the trigger? You didn't hear it. Exactly. The phone was on silent. You had very high motivation. The phone was right there next to you. Very easy to pick it up, but no trigger was present. I can't tell you how many times I walk into these big fancy design reviews. I'm hired as a consultant to look at the interface. And I say to myself, where's the trigger? What do you want the user to do? And unless there's this clear trigger present, you'll never get that behavior. Okay? Let's take a look at how one company has evolved over the years when it comes to these principles of motivation, ability, and triggers. Here's Twitter. Take a look at Twitter in 2009. Here's Twitter in 2010. And here's Twitter today. So what's changed? What do you see when it comes to motivation, ability, and triggers? What's different? Here, let's go back to 2009. OK, that's one thing. But more fundamentally, what's different?
They have to explain what
A lot more text, right? There's a lot more going on here. Look at all these triggers. What is a trigger? Why is a trigger? How is a trigger? Watch a video is a trigger. Sign in is a trigger. Click here is a trigger. Click there is a trigger. And get started join is a trigger. That's a lot of triggers. Let's look at Twitter today. How much have they simplified the intended behavior, which in all three cases was what? What's the intended behavior? Sign in or sign up. That's the intended behavior in all three cases. And when they cleared the clutter, when they made it easier to understand the intended behavior, the behavior became more likely to occur. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. But they had to explain it back then. People didn't know what Twitter was about, right? That's why they needed all this text, right? Wrong. Nobody came to Twitter in 2009 by mistake, typing twitter.com. Oops, I landed onto Twitter. That didn't happen. People came with some kind of information about what this site was for. From their friends, from the press, they had heard about the site. And Twitter discovered that by making the site easier to use, by getting users into the hook as quickly as possible, by getting them to follow other folks, other Twitter users, that's where they saw this habit take hold. That's where they saw engagement and retention increase, by making that behavior easier. The lesson here isn't copy Twitter's landing page. The lesson here is make the intended behavior as simple as possible by increasing the user's ability. Okay? So after we figured out the internal trigger, the user's itch, we use the external trigger to get the user to take the next action. The action is the simplest behavior in anticipation of reward. Now it's time for the reward itself, to scratch the user's itch. Now when we talk about rewards, we need to start in the brain. And in particular, an area of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, which was first studied by two Canadian researchers by the name of Olds and Milner, who in the 1940s connected the brains of lab animals, and in later experiments, other researchers actually did the same types of studies with people, and they connected these electrodes that were in their brains to a tiny lever that administered a tiny electrical current. So every time the mouse would press on the lever, they would receive a current in this area of the brain called the nucleus accumbens. And what they found in these experiments with lab animals and later with people is that these test subjects wanted nothing but pressing this button. They would forgo food, water. The mice would run across painful electrified grids, all to keep clicking this button. The people in these experiments had to have these machines forcibly removed to get them to stop clicking. Now, it turns out that there are other things that stimulate this very special part of the brain. Things that we desire, luxury goods, certain chemicals, sex, junk food, and right there in the middle, technology. All of these things stimulate the nucleus accumbens. At the time, Olds and Milner and much of the psychology community believed that these researchers had found the brain's pleasure center, right? Why else would lab animals and people continue to incessantly click if it wasn't because it felt good, right? Not exactly. What Olds and Milner had discovered was actually the stress of desire. Because it turns out the nucleus accumbens becomes activated in anticipation of the thing we want, before we receive the thing that's supposed to make us feel good. But when we actually get the reward itself, the thing that's supposed to bring us pleasure, that's when the nucleus accumbens becomes less active. And it turns out, so that's the itch. That's the itch we seek to scratch. When I did that little mind experiment and asked you to think about your email message, and many of you had this anxiety, this bit of tension, this curiosity, that was exactly what was happening in your brains. It was the itch that you seek to scratch, that physiological response to a psychological stimulus. And it turns out that there is a way to supercharge that response, that stress of desire, craving. Does anybody want to know what it is? Is anybody curious? Exactly. The unknown is fascinating. So when I took that long pause and I asked you a question and I changed my cadence, I did something a little different, many of you perked up. What's he going to say? What's he going to do next? Because the unknown, it turns out, increases our engagement, increases our focus, and it's also highly habit-forming. And of course, the research that showed this was the case was the classic work of B.F. Skinner. Many of you might remember as the father of operant conditioning. That when Skinner took his pigeons, he put them in a small cage. He gave them a disc that the pigeon could click on. And when the pigeon could click on the lever to receive a reward, to receive a food pellet on a predictable schedule, basically the pigeon would click the lever whenever they were hungry. But when Skinner did something a little bit different, when he added mystery, when he added what's called an intermittent reward, so the pigeon would click the lever, but nothing would happen. The pigeon would click the lever again, and something would come out. The rate of response increased. The number of times he observed the behavior went up. Because we now know that the nucleus accumbens is stimulated by variability. And time again, in the products that you find most engaging, that capture our attention, that create these habits and even addictions, we find one or more of these variable reward types. Rewards of the tribe, rewards of the hunt, and rewards of the self. Let's go through these. First and foremost, the search for social rewards, rewards of the tribe. These are things that have an element of variability, that feel good, and come from other people. So empathetic joy, feeling good because someone else feels good. Partnerships, cooperation, competition, all of these things feel good, come from other people, and have an element of variability. So on a technology like Facebook, on social media, where Mark Zuckerberg got married and 1.3 million people liked it, think about all the variability involved with a site like Facebook. What am I going to find when I open the app? When I post a picture, how many people are going to like it? What are they going to comment? High degree of variability associated with using social media. Stack Overflow. Anybody use Stack Overflow here? Okay, great, a lot of folks. So Stack Overflow, for those of you who aren't users of the site, the world's largest technical question and answer site. 5,000 questions get answered every single day, and these are not easily Googleable answers. These are sometimes highly specific, highly technical answers. Basically, it's technical documentation that people are doing for hours and hours. Why? What's going on here? Why are they doing this free work? They're not getting paid for any of this. Well, what happens when you post a Stack Overflow? What happens to your answer, those of you who use it? What happens to it? It gets upvoted, right? Upvoted or sometimes downvoted. And those upvotes turn into points, and those points turn into badges. But these badges aren't just gamification that we put on our profile. These badges mean something. They confer status among our tribe, the people whose opinions we care about, our fellow engineers in this case. Next comes the search for resources, rewards of the hunt. Now, rewards of the hunt stem from our primal search for food and other resources. And of course, today, these things are bought with money. So when many people think of variable rewards, they think about gambling, where, of course, the variable reward, the currency, is, of course, money that comes out of gambling machines. But it turns out that the same mechanism we find in Vegas, we also find in information rewards. So for example, think about the feed. Why is the feed so popular in our technologies today? Why? This didn't used to occur 5, 10 years ago. But today, everything seems to have this feed mechanism. Why is that? Let's think about this for a minute. OK, that's not interesting. That's not interesting. Oh, but that's interesting. And to get more, what do I have to do? Just keep scrolling. So this is very similar to this. Both variable rewards around search for resources, rewards of the hunt. If you want to see the masters of this, take a look at Pinterest, where I dare you to go to Pinterest and not scroll. You can't do it. And I love this little comic I got. I'm not sure if you can see it in the back. It has this little guy hunched over his desk, and it says, scroll, 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 scroll. And then he says, heh, heh, heh. And then scroll, 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 scroll. That's the behavior, searching and never done searching for these rewards of the hunt. Finally is a search for self-achievement, what I call rewards of the self. So these are things that feel good, that have an element of variability, but don't come from other people and aren't from these information or resource rewards. These are things that are intrinsically motivating, okay? Things that feel good in and of themselves. So the search for mastery, consistency, control, competency, completion, these are all examples of rewards of the self. In gameplay, right? If I'm playing a video game or an online game, getting to the next level, the next achievement, might be an example of rewards of the self. Now, if you say to yourself, yeah, but I don't really play video games. That's not for me. I bet you play this game every day. Checking that unread message, finishing off your to-dos, opening a jewel icon on your phone because there's something waiting for you there. That's all about this variable rewards around mastery, consistency, competency, and completion. Rewards of the self. So before you say to yourself, great, I'm going to put variable rewards all over my product, and it's going to be super habit forming, let me give you a few words of warning. First and foremost, your product still has to scratch the user's itch. Now, where I see time and time again gamification gone wrong, has everybody heard of gamification? Okay, using game-like mechanics like points and badges and leaderboards in non-gaming context. I'm not anti-gamification. I'm anti-using it inappropriately. And when people use it inappropriately is when the reward doesn't match the internal trigger. We have to understand the user's itch if we have any hope of addressing it in the reward phase of the hook. So the point of variable rewards is to build the reward so that we scratch the user's itch. So we give the user what they came for, and yet leave them wanting more. Some element of mystery for what they might find the next time they engage with the product. OK, the last step of the hook model. So we figured out the user's internal triggers, the itch. The simplest action in anticipation of reward. We've given the user what they've come for and yet leave them wanting more. And then finally, the investment phase. The investment phase is the piece that I think is most frequently overlooked by startups, by product people. The investment is all about small bits of work the user does for a future reward. Not about immediate gratification, but for a future benefit. And investments increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook in two ways. Number one, investments load the next trigger. Investments load the next trigger. So when you use an app like WhatsApp, which, by the way, I've had this slide for months and months and months, way before the acquisition. When you use an app like WhatsApp and you send someone a message, what do you get for it? What's the immediate gratification? Nada. You don't get anything. You don't get points. You don't get badges. Nothing really happens. What you get is that you've loaded the next trigger so that when you send that message, very soon you will get one of these in anticipation of a future reward. You'll get a little jewel on that icon that says, hey, your friend just wrote you back. They've loaded the next trigger because that is an external trigger prompting you to open the app and then, of course, go back through the hook. On Pinterest, when I invest in this pin it button, when I take the time to invest in adding this pin it button to the Chrome of my browser, the next time that I see something that I want to save, that I want to keep on the web, there's the external trigger. I've loaded the next trigger. And of course, what's the old habit that Pinterest is replacing? Bookmarking, right? It's right there next to the pin it button. And that's not coincidental. So let's, actually, I'm running a little bit low on time, so I'll skip on that. The second way that investments increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook is that investments store value. Investments store value. So one of the reasons I love working in technology is because unlike things in the physical world, things made out of atoms, your phones, your computers, these chairs, everything in the physical world, these things depreciate with use, right? They lose value with use. However, habit-forming technology should do the opposite. Habit-forming technology should appreciate with use. It should get better the more we interact with it. And it does this through this principle of stored value. So the more content I put into a product like iTunes, the better it gets as my one and only music library. The more data I put into a site like Mint.com or any other personal finance software, the more data I put into a site, the better it becomes, the more useful it becomes to me. So that if you were to log into my Pinterest account or my Facebook account, it actually wouldn't be that interesting for you because it's been customized with my data. Followers. Followers is a form of stored value that makes the product more valuable the more followers I have, so that if Twitter sent out an email and said, look, we're going to shut down Twitter unless you pay us, who's going to send them a check? Someone with 10 followers or 10,000 followers? Of course, it's going to be the person with more followers because it becomes better, the product becomes a better way to reach their audience the more followers you have. And finally, reputation. Reputation is a form of stored value that users can literally take to the bank. Because my reputation score on Airbnb or eBay or TaskRabbit can help me sell my product or my service for more money. And how likely am I to leave one of these products, one of these platforms, for a competitor once I've accrued all that stored value? Pretty unlikely. I've already invested so much in the product. Okay? So these are the two main ways that investments increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook by loading the next trigger and storing value. So to summarize, the hook is essentially an experience designed to connect your user's problem to your solution with enough frequency to form a habit. And through these successive cycles, through a trigger, action, reward, and investment, this is how users' tastes and preferences are changed. This process, this four-step process, is how we form our habits. Whew, that was a lot. I'm guessing some of you felt like you were drinking from a fire hose. That's totally OK, totally normal. The good news is, you want more? You're hooked. I have this book outside. It's also on Amazon. But let me just summarize real quick. This is a class I teach in about 3 weeks at Stanford, so I tried to compress it into about 45 minutes. So I'm sorry if that was a lot of information. But this is the most important slide, is to ask yourself when you're working on a habit-forming technology, you're evaluating the habit-forming potential of what you're working on, what is the internal trigger that your product is addressing? What's the itch? What external trigger gets the user to the product? What's the simplest action done in anticipation of reward, and how can you make it simpler? In the reward phase, is the reward fulfilling and yet leaves the user wanting more? And then finally, the investment. What's the bit of work done to increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook? Now, if you want a handy-dandy acronym, remember Atari, that a hook has 4 parts: a trigger, action, reward, and investment. How many of you remember Atari? OK, good. This is my generation. When I teach this class at Stanford, the kids have like no idea what that is, so that's good. But before I go, there's one more issue I'd like to address, and that is the morality of manipulation. That some of you during this presentation, I caught squirming and shaking your heads, and that is the appropriate human response. Because designing habit-forming products is a form of manipulation. Our technologies that we're building, that we're developing today, these are the things that people are taking with them to bed every night. It's the first thing they reach for before they even say good morning to their loved ones. And as Ian Bogo said, our technologies are quite possibly becoming the cigarettes of this century. So we as product designers, as innovators, as entrepreneurs, we have a very special responsibility because we have more power to affect people's day-to-day lives than we ever have before because of the ubiquity of these personal technologies. So my challenge to you, what I hope you will do with this information, is to find one of the world's problems. It's one thing we have no shortage of, and engage people in something meaningful, in something important, and to borrow from the words of Gandhi, to build the change that you wish to see in the world. Thank you very much. Let me say one more thing. So I'd be happy to take some questions. The last thing I wanted to ask, while I'm taking questions, I would love a favor. If you can go to this website, www.opinion2.us. Notice it's not .com, it's .us. Very, very short 5-question survey. Would love to hear what you liked, what you didn't like about the presentation. And as soon as you do that, as soon as you click Submit, you'll be taken to my SlideShare page where you can get all the slides I just presented, and you can use those any way you like.
Great. So we have time for about a few questions here. I had one here in the back, and I'll try to run around.
Sorry, just a quick, thank you very much. Good presentation. Just a quick question. To do your survey, it asked what was the title of this presentation you saw. What should we put in?
That's a test. I want to see if people remember the title. But yeah, put in what you remembered was the title.
First of all, I want to say I really like your speech. It's so neat, clear, and entertaining at the same time.
I don't know her. I promise. I didn't plan.
Oh, okay. I do have one question.
Sure.
So I believe as a psychologist, as an expert in that, you know that knowing something is also going to sort of change the user's behavior. So like today, we know this. We know the triggers. Like you, I believe when you look at those triggers, your response could be different from others because you say, oh, come on, do not try to hook me up.
Yeah.
So that's one response. So do you foresee that as time evolves, as market evolves, the users are also going to develop some kind of different behavior when they get to know more and more of this?
This is a really good question, and my hope is that
I know it is.
that everything that you heard tonight will one day be really ineffective. I hope that there's a half-life to these facts, because half the reason I do what I do is to stop unwanted manipulation. Now, there's two sides to this coin. One is to help you build products that help people form healthy habits. There's so much untapped opportunity right now that we can use to help people live better lives by helping them build healthy habits. You know, what I've taught you right now has been used for a long time, sometimes for nefarious purposes, sometimes for time-wasting purposes, but it's time to use these things for good. So that's one part of the story. The other half, and if you look at my blog over the past several years, the other half of everything I write about is how to prevent unwanted manipulation. And I hope that by understanding what's going on, right, by understanding these hooks in our lives, we can break these hooks where we need to. And I hope that over time we'll say, hey, I see what you're doing there, and these things will become less effective. Because let me tell you, I struggle with this every day. right? A big reason why I'm so motivated to keep researching and writing on this topic is because I have a problem. I know why these things are so habit-forming, and I find myself compelled to overuse them. And so I think, certainly for the kids that I teach at Stanford, this is going to be the defining trait of who can get work done and who's going to be busy, distracted, is your ability to focus, to build barriers around some of these technologies that can suck you in. So I think it's very important that we learn these 4 steps of the hook cycle so that we can do something about it, as well as forming better technologies to live with better. Sure.
I really appreciate your answer.
Yeah.
However, you also think that some things they're just basic human nature. I saw one research saying that just in ancient times, a long time ago, humans were not so focused as we are supposed to be today because of their instincts, their ability to survive. They have to be able to look at different things and being distracted all the time.
Sure.
So could it be that because those are just so basic, even by knowing, we cannot really break this cycle?
I see that. I know what's going on, and I have difficulty, right? So I think that's part of it. But I think for the vast majority of people, and it turns out it's about 98% of the population, we create antibodies for these things, right? We're in this hype cycle right now where these technologies are so new, they're so interesting that we haven't really felt the full repercussions of the costs. And now I think we're starting to see, okay, they're great, they're wonderful, but we may need to dial back in some areas. So we're seeing new technologies come out. Like, for example, there's a technology I use called Freedom. Does anybody use Freedom? I can't write without it. It's a program that disables your internet for a fixed period of time. It's a pre-commitment device. So every time I write, and I wrote the entire book using this program. I don't know how I could have gotten it done without it. I do a writing session. I type in, give me 60 minutes. And I can't use the internet without totally rebooting my machine, which is really, it's a lot of work. So it adds some friction to these unwanted behaviors. Another example, I wrote an article for TechCrunch called The Strange Sex Habits of Silicon Valley, which we're friends here. We can get personal. Which was all about how I felt that in the evenings, I was spending more time with my devices than with my wife. And so I wanted to change that problem. And so what did I do? I took a look at the hook model, at these 4 steps, and I tried to look for ways that I could break the hook of every time I felt this tension of needing to get work done, I was reaching for my phone or my iPad. So what did I do? I went to Home Depot, and I got a $5 timer. And I set this timer to 10 p.m. so that every night, my router, which is very high up on a shelf, turns off at 10 p.m. every night. Right? So what did I do? I created distance between the trigger and the action. Now, if I want to turn on the internet past 10 o'clock, I got to get a chair, I got to climb up, I got to go turn the internet on. It's a lot of work. I made it more difficult to take that intended action.
You haven't put the folding step stool right next to that.
Please.
Yeah, it seems like you're trying to use technology to basically manipulate psychology, obviously. I'm thinking about how do you get people to either forego short-term pleasure to achieve greater longer-term pleasure, or to forego, or to not, or to overcome short-term pain in order to achieve longer-term benefits. Examples. Trying to get young people not to take up smoking is one example. Smoking, obviously, short-term gives you a lot of rewards because you can hang out with your friends and engage in socializing, but at the same time, you're sort of setting yourself up for a big fall much later on. The other issue is with young people is trying to get them to sign up for health insurance. And that's been very controversial, to say the least. And obviously, there's short-term pain to overcome there because you have to pay for something that you may not immediately need, but will result in a great relief of anxiety much later on. So that's I just bring those situations seem to be at the heart of a lot of some of the bad behaviors and the later catastrophes that we end up seeing.
Yeah. So for one-time behaviors like signing up for health insurance, for example, you don't actually need this whole model. You can use B equals MAT. How can you increase motivation, make the behavior as easy as possible to do, make sure a clear trigger is present, and you'll get those behaviors. And it's amazing how many times products don't use that basic principle of making the behavior as easy as possible to do. You would be amazed at how much more likely behaviors occur when they're just made easier. But again, those are about one-time behaviors. That's not habits. When it comes to forming healthy habits, I think this is what I'm so excited about. This is how we can use technology to take things where you can't feel the immediate benefit, saving money, exercising, eating better. These are things that the reward isn't immediate. And through this ubiquitous technology, now we actually have ways to make them rewarding. Right? We have ways to make the feedback come sooner through social reward, through rewards of the hunt, through rewards of the self. Now we have these other variable reward mechanisms that don't rely on this long-term reward. And that's what I'm really interested to see in the next few years. We're already seeing it, actually.
Great. We're going to take 2 more questions. Nir's going to be also in the back selling his books, and we have a reception outside. So 2 more questions.
I want to start by saying thank you for a great talk. I learned a ton. So I thought it was very interesting that you described the nucleus accumbens study in terms of the stress of anticipating receiving a reward. It was actually my recollection from the study that the humans did stop pulling the lever, and they reported that they got bored of the sensation of next time you pull the lever, you'll get the reward. Next time you pull the lever, you'll get the reward, and they learned to stop pulling the lever. And so I'm just wondering, like we as a culture were able to quit cigarettes when they realized that they were killing us. When do you think that we as a culture will learn to stop pulling the technology lever, and what do you think is going to trigger that?
Yeah. I think the answer to that is right now. That I think when people see, we have this innate understanding that these technologies are changing our behavior. And I think when we gain greater exposure to how these things happen, that allows us to then break the hook, right? And that's what I hope will happen. Now, I don't want to blow the problem out of proportion. I don't want to create problems where they don't actually exist. For most people, we don't overuse Facebook, right? We don't. It doesn't become an addiction. They're just habits, and maybe they're bad habits, but they don't hurt our lives in the way an addiction might. So let's be clear. Now, there's a 1 to 2% of the population that goes too far, that has a psychographic profile that predisposes them to addiction. And that's a whole nother, and just because they're a small proportion doesn't mean that we shouldn't do something about them. And I think that there's a very interesting question to be asked, because for the first time, these products that addict people, the manufacturers have a direct connection to the usage of their products. So, an alcohol manufacturer can raise their hands and say, we don't know who's drinking, we don't know who has a drinking problem. But that's not the case with online gambling. Right? That's not the case with perhaps the overuse of some of our technologies. They know, right? They know who's using it too much, who's that 2% of the population that's perhaps reaping unintended consequences from these technologies' overuse. And now we have this really interesting social question of, do they have an obligation, right? Do they do something about it? But again, to be clear, for the vast majority of people, there are simple solutions. There are simple ways to kind of inoculate yourself so that you regain focus and regain control. And there's some of these technologies that I really think we should invite into our lives that can make us healthier, happier. I mean, I know a lot of these technologies, my life is way better off with Twitter, for example, and many of these other technologies. And I like the habits that I've built with these technologies. And there's many more down the line.
Why do you think advertising as a profession, as a business, still exists? We all know that it's a manipulation business. And it's a follow-on to your question, actually. If we know the triggers of advertising and no one enjoys it, why do you think it still exists?
Because it works. Because it works. That's why I do. I mean, there's this. What I've taught you here is around identifying these internal triggers in people's lives and not creating them, right? We're not creating internal triggers. We're not creating these itches. We're looking for where they currently exist in people's day-to-day routines, and we're looking for a solution to couple with that negative feeling, with that negative emotion, to provide relief to form healthy habits. Now, there's a whole other argument that perhaps advertising, and some people say this, there's this counter-argument that Facebook might do this as well, that actually Facebook makes these internal triggers, that the more time we spend on Facebook seeing how happy our friends are, that maybe we ourselves are becoming less happy. So there's been studies that have shown that. There's also been studies that show the exact opposite, so there's no conclusion. But there's also, let me leave it at that before I get myself in too much trouble.
Great. So on behalf of PARC, we'd like to thank Nir for coming and joining us and making a very informative, very interesting
Thank you.
forum.